The summer heat was brutal that Tuesday morning when 17-year-old Damon stepped off the Greyhound bus at the gates of Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado. His worn sneakers hit the pavement, and he looked up at the imposing entrance with its armed guards and serious-faced soldiers. For a kid from the rough neighborhoods of Cleveland, this place felt like stepping into another world entirely. Damon clutched his acceptance letter tightly in his sweaty palm. The Youth Aviation Excellence Program had selected only 20 high school students from across the country, and somehow his name had made the list. He still couldn't quite believe it. Kids from his block didn't usually end up at military bases learning about fighter jets. They ended up working at fast food places, or if they were lucky, maybe a factory job. The security guard at the checkpoint looked him up and down with barely concealed doubt. "You sure you're in the right place, son?" the man asked, checking Damon's ID against his clipboard. The question stung, but Damon was used to it. He'd been getting those looks his whole life. "Yes, sir, I'm here for the aviation program," Damon replied politely, though his jaw tightened a bit. He'd learned early that politeness often helped when people already had their minds made up about you. After what felt like forever, the guard waved him through. Damon picked up his single duffel bag and walked toward the visitor center where he was supposed to meet the other program participants. As he walked, he couldn't help but stare at everything around him. Fighter jets roared overhead, their engines creating thunder that seemed to shake the very ground. Mechanics in green coveralls worked on aircraft that looked like something from a science fiction movie. This was definitely not Cleveland. At the visitor center, 19 other teenagers were already gathered. Most of them looked like they belonged here. Clean-cut kids with expensive luggage and confident smiles. They were talking about their private pilot lessons and engineering camps they'd attended. One kid mentioned how his father was a colonel at another base. Another talked about the flight simulator in his family's basement. Damon found an empty chair in the back and sat quietly, listening to conversations about things he'd only read about online. While these kids had been taking flying lessons and attending space camps, he'd been working evenings at his uncle's auto repair shop, trying to help his mom pay the bills. Not exactly the same preparation. "All right, everyone, listen up." A stern-looking woman in uniform entered the room. Colonel Linda Hayes introduced herself as the program director. She was probably in her 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that seemed to see right through you. "Welcome to Peterson Air Force Base. Over the next 6 weeks, you'll get hands-on experience with some of the most advanced aircraft in the world." She continued explaining the program rules and schedule, but Damon noticed how her gaze seemed to skip over him more than once. When she talked about the caliber of students they'd selected, her eyes lingered on the kids, with the confident smiles and expensive gear. After the orientation, the group was divided into smaller teams for their first assignment, a basic tour of the maintenance hangar. Technical Sergeant Williams, a friendly black man in his 30s, would be their guide. Damon felt a small wave of relief seeing someone who looked like him in a position of authority here. The hangar was massive, filled with aircraft in various stages of maintenance and repair. The smell of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid hung in the air. Damon's eyes went wide as he took in the sophisticated equipment and the organized chaos of military aircraft maintenance. "These birds are more computer than airplane these days, Sergeant," Williams explained, patting the wing of an F-16. "Every system is connected to every other system. One small problem can ground a multi-million-dollar aircraft." While the other students asked predictable questions about speed and weapon systems, Damon found himself drawn to the technical details. He noticed things that others missed. The way certain panels were designed for quick access, how the wiring was routed to prevent interference, the redundant backup systems that kept pilots safe. "You seem pretty interested in the technical side," Sergeant Williams said, noticing Damon studying a diagnostic computer display. "It's just similar to what I've worked on before," Damon replied carefully. He didn't want to sound like he was bragging, but he also didn't want to seem completely clueless. "Oh yeah? What kind of experience do you have?" "My uncle runs a repair shop back home. I've been helping him since I was 12. Mostly cars, but I've also fixed motorcycles, small aircraft engines, even some electronic equipment." Damon paused, then added, I know it's not the same as this stuff, but a lot of the principles are similar. Sergeant Williams raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. Most of the other kids had theoretical knowledge from books and classes, but actual hands-on repair experience was rare among teenagers, especially at this level. What got you interested in aviation specifically? The sergeant asked. Damon's face lit up for the first time that day. When I was 10, a small plane made an emergency landing in the field behind our neighborhood. The pilot was okay, but the engine had failed. I watched the mechanics work on it for 3 days straight. They let me help with some of the simpler stuff, and I just got hooked, I guess. Started reading everything I could find about aircraft engines and systems. That evening in the dormitory, Damon lay on his narrow bunk listening to his roommate, a kid named Tyler from Connecticut, video calling his parents about his first day. Tyler complained about the basic accommodations and wondered why they couldn't stay in better quarters. Damon stared at the ceiling, thinking about his mom working double shifts at the hospital to make ends meet. These 6 weeks at Peterson represented an opportunity he might never get again. While Tyler saw this as just another summer program to add to his college applications, for Damon it could be the doorway to a completely different life. The next morning brought their first real challenge. Each student had to complete a basic diagnostic test on a training aircraft engine. It was designed to separate those who really understood mechanical systems from those who had just memorized textbook answers. Damon watched as several students struggled with the practical application of concepts they'd learned in theory. They could explain how a turbine engine worked on paper, but when faced with an actual problem, they seemed lost. Meanwhile, Damon approached the task methodically, using troubleshooting skills he'd developed in his uncle's shop. Within 30 minutes, he'd identified the simulated problem and explained his reasoning to the evaluating instructor. The man looked surprised, then impressed, as Damon walked him through the logical process he'd used to isolate the issue. "Where did you learn to think through problems like that?" the instructor asked. "Trial and error, mostly," Damon answered honestly. "When you're working on a 20-year-old car with no diagnostic computer, you learn to use your eyes, ears, and brain. You follow the evidence wherever it leads." By the end of the first week, word had started to spread among the instructors about the quiet kid from Cleveland who seemed to have an unusual natural talent for understanding complex mechanical systems. But Damon also noticed the skeptical looks from some of the base personnel, and he heard the whispered comments about diversity programs and lowering standards. He knew he'd have to prove himself every single day. Being here wasn't enough. He had to be better than good enough. He had to be undeniably excellent. And deep down, despite all the doubt he saw in other people's eyes, Damon believed he could be exactly that. It was Thursday morning of the third week when everything went wrong. Damon was in the classroom studying flight control systems when he heard the commotion outside. Raised voices, the sound of heavy boots running across the tarmac, and then the unmistakable whine of equipment being wheeled rapidly across the hangar floor. Through the window, he could see mechanics and engineers rushing toward Hangar C, where the F-16 Fighting Falcons were housed. Something big was happening, and it didn't look good. "What's all that noise about?" asked Kevin, one of the other program participants, looking up from his textbook. Before anyone could answer, Sergeant Williams burst through the classroom door, his usually calm demeanor replaced by obvious stress. "Program suspended for the day, everyone. Head back to your quarters and stay there until further notice." "But Sergeant, what's happening?" Tyler asked, his voice filled with curiosity rather than concern. "One of our birds is down. That's all you need to know right now." The sergeant's tone made it clear the conversation was over, but Damon had grown up in a neighborhood where you learned to read between the lines of what adults told you. Something serious had happened, and from the way the sergeant's jaw was clenched, it wasn't going to be fixed easily. Back in the dormitory, rumors started flying immediately. Some kids thought it was just routine maintenance. Others speculated about a training accident. Tyler, who seemed to have inside information about everything, claimed his father had told him that these older F-16s were always breaking down. But Damon had been around enough broken machinery to recognize the particular kind of urgency he'd seen outside. This wasn't routine maintenance or a simple part replacement. This was the kind of problem that made experienced mechanics scratch their heads and call in specialists. Over the next 2 days, the normal rhythm of the base was completely disrupted. Instead of the usual training flights taking off every few hours, the airfield was eerily quiet. The students were kept busy with classroom instruction and simulator time, but everyone could feel the tension in the air. Damon noticed that many of the senior mechanics and engineers looked exhausted, like they'd been working around the clock. He'd see them in the mess hall at odd hours, huddled over technical manuals and laptop computers, speaking in the kind of frustrated whispers that meant nothing was going according to plan. On Saturday morning, while most of the other students were sleeping in, Damon decided to take a walk around the base. He wasn't supposed to be near the restricted hangars, but his curiosity had gotten the better of him. As he approached Hangar C, he could hear voices through the partially open bay doors. "I'm telling you, Chief, we've replaced every component twice. The diagnostic system keeps giving us different readings every time we run it." The voice belonged to Dr. Patricia Chen, a civilian contractor who had been introduced to the students as one of the Air Force's top avionics specialists. "Well, something's causing this bird to think it's in a flat spin when it's sitting perfectly still on the ground," came the reply from Chief Master Sergeant Rodriguez. "And until we figure out what, this $20 million piece of equipment is nothing but an expensive paperweight." Damon crept closer, staying in the shadows near a maintenance cart. Through the gap in the doors, he could see the F-16 surrounded by diagnostic equipment, computer terminals, and frustrated-looking technicians. "The manufacturer's tech support is stumped too," Dr. Chen continued. "They've never seen a failure pattern like this. The flight control computer is getting conflicting data from multiple sensors, but when we test each sensor individually, I'll check out perfectly." "How long has it been down now?" asked another voice. 4 days. And we've got that joint training exercise with the Navy next week. If we can't get this bird airworthy..." Chief Rodriguez didn't finish the sentence, but his tone said everything. Damon understood the implications. Military units took their readiness seriously. Having aircraft grounded during important training exercises was the kind of thing that could affect careers and budgets. The pressure to fix this problem had to be enormous. He watched as teams of technicians ran test after test, replacing parts that tested perfectly fine, recalibrating systems that appeared to be working correctly, and growing more frustrated by the hour. These were clearly the best minds the Air Force had available, people with decades of experience and access to the most sophisticated diagnostic equipment money could buy. Yet the F-16 remained stubbornly broken. Over the following days, Damon noticed the base's entire routine had shifted around this one grounded aircraft. Training schedules were being rewritten. Other planes were being pushed harder to compensate, and in the dining hall, he overheard phone conversations about bringing in additional specialists from other bases. "They're flying in a team from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base," Tyler mentioned during lunch, apparently having gotten this information from one of his mysterious sources. "And rumor is they might have to ship the whole plane back to the manufacturer if they can't figure it out soon." The thought of that expensive, sophisticated aircraft being loaded onto a cargo plane like a broken appliance seemed almost absurd to Damon. But he'd seen similar situations in his uncle's shop, where a relatively simple problem could hide behind layers of complexity, fooling even experienced mechanics for days or weeks. On Wednesday morning, exactly 1 week after the F-16 had first gone down, Damon was walking past Hangar C again when he overheard a heated discussion between Colonel Hayes and several senior officers. "Sir, with respect, we've exhausted every standard diagnostic procedure," Chief Rodriguez was saying. "We've had 3 different contractor teams look at it. We've replaced half the avionics suite. At some point, we have to consider that this might be a fundamental design flaw that requires factory intervention." "Unacceptable," Colonel Hayes replied sharply. "That bird was flying perfectly fine last week. Something changed, and I want to know what. We don't give up and ship our problems back to the manufacturer just because the solution isn't obvious. Ma'am, we're not giving up, but we're also not making any progress. Maybe fresh eyes from outside the Air Force could..." "The last thing we need is some civilian contractor telling Congress that our maintenance crews can't handle their own equipment," the colonel interrupted. "Find another approach. As Damon continued his walk, he found himself thinking about the problem from a different angle. In his uncle's shop, the most frustrating issues were usually the ones where everything appeared to be working correctly when tested individually, but somehow failed when the whole system was operating together. He remembered a particularly stubborn problem with a customer's truck, where the engine would run perfectly in the shop but stall randomly on the road. They'd replaced sensors, cleaned connections, updated software, and checked every component the diagnostic computer flagged. Nothing worked. It wasn't until Damon had noticed a tiny vibration in an engine mount during a test drive that they discovered the real culprit, a hairline crack in a bracket that only opened up under specific conditions, causing intermittent electrical contact issues that confused all the computer diagnostics. The solution had been embarrassingly simple once they found it, but finding it had required looking beyond what the sophisticated diagnostic equipment was telling them. Now, listening to the frustrated voices of some of the most skilled aircraft technicians in the world, Damon wondered if they might be facing a similar situation. Sometimes the most advanced diagnostic tools could actually make problems harder to solve by providing too much information, or by making assumptions about what kinds of failures were possible. But he was just a 17-year-old kid from Cleveland. What could he possibly know that teams of expert engineers with decades of experience had missed? By Friday afternoon, the atmosphere on the base had become almost desperate. Damon could see it in the way people walked a little faster, talked a little quieter, and how even the normally cheerful mess hall staff seemed tense. The grounded F-16 had become more than just a mechanical problem. It was turning into a crisis that threatened to embarrass the entire base. During their afternoon classroom session on hydraulic systems, Damon found it hard to concentrate. His mind kept wandering to what he'd overheard earlier that morning. Colonel Hayes had been on the phone with someone at headquarters, and her voice had carried more stress than he'd ever heard from her before. "Yes, sir, I understand the implications," she'd said. "But flying in another contractor team isn't going to help if the problem is something we're all missing. We need a different approach, not more of the same thinking." When the class ended, instead of heading straight back to the dormitory like the other students, Damon decided to take another walk past Hangar C. He told himself he was just curious, but deep down he knew he was hoping to overhear something that might give him a clue about what was really going wrong. As he approached the hangar, he could hear the familiar sounds of diagnostic equipment running through its cycles. But there was something else too, a very faint electrical humming that seemed to come and go. It was so subtle that most people probably wouldn't notice it at all. But Damon had trained his ears to pick up unusual sounds during years of troubleshooting in his uncle's noisy shop. He moved closer to the hangar wall, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It definitely wasn't coming from the main diagnostic equipment, which made a completely different kind of noise. This was something else entirely. "Still no luck, Chief?" Dr. Chen's voice carried from inside the hangar. "Nothing. We've now replaced literally every component that the diagnostic system suggested might be faulty. Twice. And we're still getting the same phantom readings. What if the diagnostic system itself is the problem?" suggested another technician. "We thought of that. Brought in backup equipment from 2 other bases. Same results every time." Damon pressed his ear closer to the wall. That humming sound was definitely there, and it seemed to pulse in a regular pattern, almost like interference from some kind of electrical source. Suddenly, he remembered a problem from the previous summer at his uncle's shop. A customer had brought in a classic muscle car that kept blowing fuses randomly. The car's electrical system would work perfectly for days. Then suddenly multiple circuits would fail at once for no apparent reason. His uncle had been ready to give up when Damon noticed that the problems only happened when the customer used his car radio. Further investigation revealed that the aftermarket stereo system was creating electromagnetic interference that confused the car's original wiring. The interference was so subtle that it didn't show up on most diagnostic equipment, but it was enough to cause cascade failures throughout the electrical system. Could something similar be happening with the F-16? Damon knew he was probably being ridiculous. These were military engineers with decades of experience working on some of the most sophisticated aircraft in the world. What could a teenager from Cleveland possibly know that they didn't? but that humming sound was bothering him. It was too regular to be random, and it definitely wasn't part of the normal hangar noise. He spent the next 20 minutes walking around the outside of the hangar, trying to trace the source of the sound. It seemed to be stronger near the back corner of the building, where several auxiliary power units and support equipment were housed. As he stood there listening, Chief Rodriguez emerged from the hangar looking more frustrated than Damon had ever seen him. The man walked directly toward a small electrical panel mounted on the outside wall, right where the humming seemed to be strongest. "Excuse me, Chief," Damon said before he could stop himself. The older man looked up, clearly surprised to see one of the student program participants in this area. "What are you doing back here, son? You know students aren't supposed to be near the restricted hangars." "I know, sir, I couldn't help overhearing about the problems with the F-16, and I noticed something that might be important." "Chief," Rodriguez's expression shifted from surprise to skepticism. "Oh, really? And what might that be?" Damon felt his face getting hot, but he pressed on. "There's an electrical humming coming from somewhere around here. It's very faint, but it has a regular pattern to it. In my experience, that usually means electromagnetic interference from some kind of faulty equipment." "Your experience?" The chief's tone wasn't exactly mocking, but it wasn't encouraging either. "Yes, sir. I've worked on automotive electrical systems for several years, and I've seen similar problems before. Sometimes a small source of interference can cause cascade failures throughout a whole network of electronic systems." Chief Rodriguez studied Damon for a long moment. "You think some kind of electrical interference is causing our F-16 to report false sensor readings?" "It's possible, sir. I know aircraft systems are much more sophisticated than car stereos, but the basic principles of electromagnetic interference are the same. If there's a source of interference that's strong enough and at the right frequency, it could potentially confuse multiple sensor systems at once." "And you think you can hear this interference?" Damon nodded. "It's coming from somewhere, near that electrical panel. The sound gets stronger when I get closer to it." For a moment, the chief looked like he was going to dismiss Damon's suggestion entirely. But then something seemed to shift in his expression. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe it was the memory of his own early days as a young mechanic when fresh eyes sometimes saw things that experience had made invisible. "All right," he said finally. "Show me what you're talking about." Damon led him closer to the electrical panel, pointing out how the humming sound grew stronger in that area. Chief Rodriguez listened carefully, his trained ear trying to pick up what this teenager was hearing. "I can't hear what you're describing," he admitted after a few minutes. "But that doesn't mean it's not there. My hearing isn't what it used to be after 30 years around jet engines." "Chief, if you don't mind me asking, what exactly is this panel connected to?" Rodriguez checked the label on the panel. "Auxiliary. Power distribution for hangar equipment. Lights, ventilation systems, some of the portable diagnostic equipment. And has anyone checked whether this equipment might be creating interference with the aircraft sensors?" The chief was quiet for a long moment. "No," he said slowly. "We've been so focused on the aircraft itself that we never considered external interference sources. All of our diagnostic protocols assume that any problems are internal to the aircraft systems. In automotive work, we call it chasing the ghost," Damon explained. "You keep looking for problems inside the system that's failing, but sometimes the real problem is something completely outside that system affecting it." Chief Rodriguez looked at the electrical panel, then back at Damon, then toward the hangar, where teams of experts had been working around the clock for over a week. "You know what, son? At this point, we've tried everything else. Let me go get Dr. Chen and see if we can test your theory." As the chief walked back toward the hangar, Damon felt a mixture of excitement and terror. What if he was completely wrong? What if he'd just made a fool of himself in front of some of the most skilled aircraft technicians in the Air Force? But what if he was right? What if the solution to a problem that had stumped dozens of experts was something as simple as a faulty electrical connection in an auxiliary power panel? He was about to find out which it was going to be. 10 minutes later, Chief Rodriguez returned with Dr. Chen and 2 other senior technicians. Damon could see the mixture of curiosity and skepticism on their faces as they approached. He felt his stomach tighten with nerves, but tried to keep his voice steady. "This is the student I was telling you about. the chief said to Dr. Chen. He thinks he's identified a potential source of electromagnetic interference. Dr. Chen looked at Damon with the polite but doubtful expression adults often gave teenagers who claimed to know something important. I understand you have some experience with electrical systems? Yes, ma'am. I've been working on automotive electrical problems for about 5 years now. I know aircraft systems are much more complex, but some of the basic principles are the same. And you believe you can hear interference that our equipment hasn't detected? Damon nodded, feeling heat rise in his cheeks. It's a very faint humming sound. It comes and goes in a regular pattern, about every 3 seconds. I noticed it's strongest near that auxiliary power panel. One of the technicians, a man named Sergeant Jackson, crossed his arms. Kid, we've got some of the most sensitive diagnostic equipment in the world. If there was electromagnetic interference strong enough to affect an F-16's sensor systems, our instruments would have picked it up immediately. Maybe, Damon replied carefully. But in my experience, sometimes the most sophisticated equipment can miss simple problems because it's looking for complex ones. It's like having a microscope so powerful you can't see the big picture anymore. Dr. Chen raised an eyebrow. That was actually a more insightful observation than she'd expected from a teenager. All right, show us what you're hearing. Damon led the group to the spot where the humming seemed strongest. Right here. Can you hear that electrical sound? It's not constant. It pulses regularly. The adults listened intently. Chief Rodriguez shook his head. I still can't hear it, but like I said, my ears aren't what they used to be. Dr. Chen closed her eyes and concentrated. After about 30 seconds, she opened them with a surprised expression. Actually, I think I can hear something. Very faint, but there's definitely a rhythmic electrical noise. Sergeant Jackson looked unconvinced. Even if there is some minor electrical noise, how could that possibly interfere with systems inside a shielded aircraft? Well, Damon said, gaining confidence. In cars, I've seen cases where electromagnetic interference could cause multiple sensor failures at once. The interference doesn't have to be strong enough to completely overpower the systems. It just has to be at the right frequency to create false signals that confuse the diagnostic computers. The kid might have a point, Dr. Chen said thoughtfully. We've been assuming that because each individual sensor tests fine in isolation, the problem has to be in the central processing unit or the wiring harnesses. But if there's external interference affecting multiple sensors simultaneously, it would create exactly the kind of conflicting data patterns we've been seeing. Chief Rodriguez finished. Different sensors reporting impossible combinations of readings. But how do we test this theory? Asked Sergeant Jackson. Damon had been thinking about that exact question. In automotive work, when we suspect electromagnetic interference, we usually try to isolate the suspected source and see if the problem goes away. Could we temporarily shut down power to this panel and run a diagnostic test on the aircraft? The technicians looked at each other. It was such a simple approach that none of them had considered it. They'd been focused on replacing components and recalibrating systems, not on eliminating potential external factors. We'd need to coordinate with base operations, Dr. Chen said. That panel controls lighting and ventilation for this section of the hangar, but it's certainly worth trying. 20 minutes later, after getting permission from the base commander and ensuring backup lighting was in place, Sergeant Jackson threw the switch that cut power to the auxiliary panel. The subtle humming that only Damon and Dr. Chen had been able to hear disappeared immediately. All right, Chief Rodriguez said. Let's run a full diagnostic sequence and see what happens. The group moved into the hangar where the F-16 sat surrounded by diagnostic equipment. Damon watched from a respectful distance as the technicians began their tests. He could feel his heart pounding as the computers began their analysis of the aircraft's systems. Initial sensor readings look normal, announced one of the technicians monitoring the main diagnostic display. Flight control computer is reporting. All systems nominal, called out another. Dr. Chen looked at her laptop screen with growing amazement. I'm not seeing any of the conflicting data patterns we've been dealing with for the past week. Chief Rodriguez ran through the complete diagnostic sequence twice more. Each time the results were consistent. No phantom readings, No impossible sensor combinations. No cascade failures. The F-16 systems were reporting exactly what they should be reporting. "I'll be damned," Sergeant Jackson said quietly. The kid was right. "But how is that possible?" asked one of the younger technicians. "How could a simple electrical panel cause interference with military-grade avionics?" Dr. Chen was already investigating that question, using a handheld electromagnetic field detector near the now silent panel. "There's definitely some kind of fault in this electrical system. I'm reading intermittent high-frequency emissions that could potentially interfere with sensitive electronics. The question is, what's causing it?" Chief Rodriguez said. "That's where my automotive experience might help again," Damon offered hesitantly. "In cars, this kind of intermittent electromagnetic interference is usually caused by either a failing electrical component that's arcing internally, or by a loose connection that's making and breaking contact repeatedly." "Makes sense," Dr. Chen agreed. "The regular 3-second pattern you heard could be consistent with a faulty relay, or contactor cycling on and off." Chief Rodriguez called for an electrician to examine the panel more closely. Within an hour, they'd identified the culprit: a failing relay in the hangar's ventilation control system. The relay had developed an internal fault that caused it to generate electromagnetic interference every time it cycled, which happened to be every 3 seconds as the system tried to maintain proper air circulation. The interference was at just the right frequency and strength to confuse the F-16's sensor networks, but it was subtle enough that it hadn't registered on the standard diagnostic equipment that was designed to detect much stronger interference patterns. "This is unbelievable," Dr. Chen said, as they watched the electrician replace the faulty relay. "We spent a week replacing aircraft components and running sophisticated diagnostic tests, and the problem was a $20 relay in the building's ventilation system." "Sometimes the simplest explanation really is the right one," Chief Rodriguez added, looking at Damon with new respect. "Good catch, son. Really good catch." As they powered the auxiliary panel back up with the new relay installed, the hangar returned to normal operations. But this time, there was no electromagnetic interference. The F-16's diagnostic systems ran clean, with no conflicting readings or phantom faults. "We should run a full flight readiness check," Dr. Chen suggested. "But I think this bird is ready to fly again." Chief Rodriguez nodded, then turned to Damon. "I owe you an apology, young man. When you first approached me, I thought you were just another eager student trying to get attention. I should have listened more carefully from the beginning." "No apology necessary, Chief. I know how it must have sounded having some kid claim he could solve a problem that had stumped all the experts. Well, you did solve it. And you did it by thinking about the problem differently than the rest of us. That's valuable, no matter how old you are." As the group began preparing for the aircraft's return to flight status, Damon felt a mixture of pride and disbelief. He'd actually done it. He'd helped solve a problem that had grounded a multi-million-dollar fighter jet for over a week. But more than that, he'd proven something important to himself: his background, his different way of looking at problems, his willingness to trust, his instincts. Those weren't disadvantages. They were strengths that could make a real difference even in the most sophisticated environments. Word spread across Peterson Air Force Base faster than Damon could have imagined. By Monday morning, 3 days after the F-16 had been successfully returned to flight status, everyone seemed to know about the teenager from Cleveland who had solved the problem that had stumped the experts. Damon was walking to breakfast when Sergeant Williams approached him with a huge grin. "Well, well, well. Look who's become famous around here. I heard Colonel Hayes wants to see you in her office after morning classes." "Am I in trouble?" Damon asked, his stomach dropping. He'd been careful to stay within the rules of the program, but he knew he'd been in areas where students weren't supposed to be. "Trouble? Son, you just saved this base from what could have been a very embarrassing situation. I don't think you need to worry about getting in trouble." The morning classes seemed to drag on forever. Damon found it impossible to concentrate on hydraulic system theory when his mind kept racing about what Colonel Hayes might want to discuss. The other students had been treating him differently too. Some seemed impressed, others maybe a little jealous that he'd gotten so much attention. Tyler, his roommate, had been particularly quiet since news of Damon's success had spread. "I still don't understand how you figured it out when all those engineers couldn't," he'd said the night before, and there was something in his tone that suggested he wasn't entirely happy about it. Finally, afternoon arrived, and Damon found himself standing outside Colonel Hayes's office, nervously straightening his uniform shirt. When he knocked, her voice called for him to enter. The colonel's office was more impressive than he'd expected, with awards and photographs covering the walls and a large window overlooking the flight line. Colonel Hayes sat behind her desk, but she wasn't alone. Dr. Chen was there, along with Chief Rodriguez and another officer Damon didn't recognize. "Airman Thompson, please have a seat," Colonel Hayes said, gesturing to a chair facing her desk. The formal use of airman surprised him. That wasn't how anyone had addressed him before. "Sir, I mean, ma'am, I'm not actually... I know you're not enlisted yet," the colonel interrupted with a slight smile. "But after what you accomplished last week, I think you've earned the courtesy of the title." The unknown officer leaned forward. "Damon, I'm Colonel Martinez from Air Force Recruiting Command. I drove down from Denver specifically to meet you." Damon's heart started racing again. This was definitely not what he'd expected. "What you did last week was remarkable," Colonel Hayes began. "Not just because you solved a difficult technical problem, but because of how you approached it. You saw something that experienced professionals missed, and you had the courage to speak up about it. Dr. Chen has been telling me about your diagnostic methodology," Colonel Martinez added. "The way you traced the problem systematically, using both technical knowledge and practical experience. That's exactly the kind of thinking we need in the Air Force." "I just noticed something that sounded wrong," Damon said modestly. "Anyone could have done the same thing." "But they didn't," Chief Rodriguez pointed out. "I've been working on aircraft for over 20 years, and I walked past that electrical panel dozens of times without hearing what you heard. That takes a special kind of awareness." Colonel Hayes opened a folder on her desk. "Damon, we've been looking at your academic records from high school. Your grades are excellent, particularly in mathematics and science. Combined with your demonstrated practical skills, you're exactly the kind of person we want in our aerospace engineering programs. What we're offering," Colonel Martinez said, "is a full scholarship to the Air Force Academy, with a guaranteed slot in our aeronautical engineering program. Upon graduation, you'd be commissioned as a second lieutenant and assigned to an aircraft development or maintenance engineering unit." Damon felt like the room was spinning. "A full scholarship to the Air Force Academy?" "Full tuition, room, board, books, plus a monthly stipend," Colonel Martinez confirmed. "And after your performance here, I think we can also arrange for some advanced placement in technical courses." "I don't know what to say," Damon said honestly. "I never imagined anything like this was possible." "There's no pressure to decide immediately," Colonel Hayes assured him. "Take some time to think it over, discuss it with your family. But I want you to know that what you did here has opened doors that might not have been available otherwise." Dr. Chen spoke up for the first time. "I've also been in contact with some colleagues in the civilian aerospace industry. If military service isn't what you want, there are other opportunities. Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and several other companies have expressed interest in meeting you." "Really? Just because of fixing one problem?" "It's not just about fixing the problem," Chief Rodriguez explained. "It's about how you think. You approached a complex issue with fresh eyes and practical wisdom. That combination is rare in engineering, whether military or civilian." After the meeting, Damon walked across the base in a daze. Everything had changed so quickly. A few weeks ago, he'd been just another kid from Cleveland, helping his uncle fix cars and hoping maybe he could afford community college. Now he was being offered opportunities he'd only dreamed about. That evening, he called his mother from the base phone center. She cried when he told her about the scholarship offer, and he could hear the pride and amazement in her voice. "Baby, I always knew you were special," she said through her tears. "But this is going to change everything for our family." His uncle got on the phone too. "I'm proud of you, nephew. You took everything I taught you and made it into something bigger than I ever imagined. Your father would have been so proud." The mention of his father, who had died when Damon was 12, brought tears to his own eyes. He'd often wondered what his dad would think of his interest in mechanics and engineering. Now he had his answer. Over the remaining weeks of the program, Damon found himself in a unique position. The instructors treated him with new respect, often asking for his insights on problems they were discussing. Other students looked at him differently too, some with admiration, others with a bit of envy, but all with recognition that he was no longer just another participant. He spent extra time in the hangars, learning advanced diagnostic techniques from Chief Rodriguez and Dr. Chen. They seemed genuinely interested in teaching him, and he soaked up every piece of knowledge they shared. On the last day of the program, there was a graduation ceremony attended by families and base personnel. Damon's mother had flown out from Cleveland, her first time ever on an airplane. She sat in the front row, beaming with pride as Colonel Hayes called him forward. "This young man exemplifies the best qualities we look for in future Air Force officers," the colonel announced to the assembled crowd. "Innovation, persistence, and the courage to challenge conventional thinking when necessary." As Damon shook hands with the base commander and received his program certificate, he looked out at the audience and saw Chief Rodriguez and Dr. Chen applauding enthusiastically. Sergeant Williams was there too, grinning and giving him a thumbs up, but it was his mother's face that meant the most to him. She was crying again, but these were tears of joy and hope for a future that had seemed impossible just a few weeks ago. 6 months later, Damon would enter the Air Force Academy as part of the newest class of cadets. His story had become part of base legend, told to new groups of students as an example of how different perspectives and practical experience could solve problems that theory alone couldn't handle. The grounded F-16 had returned to full service, flying training missions and participating in exercises around the country. But more importantly, a young man from Cleveland had discovered that his background wasn't a limitation. It was his greatest strength. And that discovery would shape not just his own future, but inspire countless others who came after him to believe that they too could achieve things they'd never thought possible.